You guys know what I hate more than anything in this world? Walking up to a nice car, looking into the engine bay, and seeing just oil everywhere. It's horrible because a lot of people pay attention to the outside, how their car looks on the outside, but they don't pay attention to how it functions on the inside. Now that's the most important part, and that's what we're going to be addressing today. Today, I got an oil leak, which is unfortunate because I already did the timing belt, I did all the seals and everything, but I did not do one part that ended up being the part that is now leaking. So as you guys can see, this is the engine bay of my IS300. So if you look in here, most of the pretty notorious spots that you find oil leaks, the valve covers, down below, over by the rear main, it's all pretty dry, except right here. The moisture around this timing cover is a telltale sign. So right now I'm gonna pull this timing cover off and I'll show you guys what's actually leaking. Yep, just as I suspected. So that gear on the later model 2JZs is actually a VVTI actuator, which means that they actually design it to move around a little bit. This basically allows the ECU to control your valve timing on the intake side using that cam phaser to make sure that it's at the right spot and be able to make more power, be able to have a little bit better drivability. Now the issue is that that gear has high pressure oil going through it. That's how it actuates the camshaft to make sure that it's in the right timing. So when they start to get old, there's an O-ring inside of that gear that actually starts to get brittle and it'll fail. So I'm sure that once we pull that gear off and take it apart, we're gonna find a very, very hard, if not broken O-ring. So we're going to replace that today. Now really the right way to do it, according to the book, would be just to replace the whole cam gear. Those are expensive. I don't want to do that. A rebuild kit for them is like $12 online. I'll link it in the description just so you guys can see where I bought it. But it's honestly really not that hard to do. As long as you pay attention, you really can't mess it up. So I'm going to go ahead and do it that way. The only issue is that we're pretty much going to have to pull all of the timing belt stuff apart again, which I already just did on this car. It's annoying, but we got to get it fixed. I'm not going to run around with an oil leak. That's not my MO. So let's get this thing torn apart. So since we are going to be taking the timing belt off, I'm going to make sure to set my engine to top dead center. Compression stroke on piston number 1. That's going to make sure that once we are doing stuff, once we're taking stuff off of it, we know exactly where our timing is and we don't have to worry about messing anything up. So right now we're at top dead center. Now there's 2 different timing marks. I'm going to show you guys what they mean. This is one of the most confusing parts about doing 2JZ timing belts that a lot of people get wrong, and it can actually mess up your engine. So you got 2 timing marks on both of these pulleys. You've got the line and the dot. So which one do you line it up at? This is where having a little bit of knowledge comes into play. So as you can see on our crank pulley, we have a line there that's lined up with the 0, but we also have one a little bit out of frame, a little bit farther. So what we can actually do is we can turn the crank pulley back a few degrees, and that's actually gonna line up that line with the 0 and this dot with the lines on the timing cover. This is going to set you to a few degrees before top dead center, and that's actually where you want to start with all of this stuff. Because since these are interference motors, if you have it set to top dead center, that's where the piston is at the very top of its travel, and you move these valves at all, they're going to come in contact with the piston, and you might bend a valve, you might do some stuff and damage some internal engine parts that you do not want to do. So make sure to set them to the dots and set them to the second line on the crank pulley. So right now we're on the lines. We're just going to go ahead and go backwards a little bit to get to the dots. So as you guys can see, our dots are now lined up, and our second line is lined up with the 0 on the timing cover. So now that we're at this point, I'm going to start taking some timing covers off. I'm also going to have to take off this valve cover just so I can hold the camshaft while I'm taking the cam gear off of it. But that I will get done after I take all these covers off. Super easy, just a bunch of little bolts all around. Once you kind of clear up some space, it gets really easy to get to everything. So now comes the part where it gets a little bit sketchy because I'm gonna try to loosen these without pulling the valve cover off. To do that, I'm going to use that cam pulley holding tool and leave the timing belt on and just hold the other camshaft, and hopefully I'll be able to break them loose without having to pull the valve cover, and then I'll torque them the same way. It's a little sketchy, I know, but bear with me, it might work. So that was the easy one, just the cap. After the cap, we're going to have an actual bolt to take off, and that's going to be the sketchy one. Oh. Wow. Should have put rags under that. Yeah, did I mention there's oil in that gear? That wasn't even bad. That was not even bad. So now the cam gear is loose, but it's not all the way off. I'm going to go ahead and pull the tensioner so we can get the belt off, and I'll get that gear off. Now that we got the gear off, you guys can see what I'm looking for when I'm inspecting this. So right now, I'm looking at the actual cam seal and seeing if that's wet at all anywhere around it, and it isn't. It's actually super dry everywhere outside of the cam seal, right there. All of our oil spatter starts outside of where the gear is. You see, like, this part of the metal plate really doesn't have any oil on it, but it's all out here where it does. That makes me 100% sure that it was our cam gear that was leaking and causing that oil that I'm seeing in the engine bay. So that's good news. That means that what we're doing is going to fix it and I won't have any oil leaks anymore. Honestly, I'm really glad that that whole thing with the cam worked out, because the only other way to get that gear off is to pull the valve cover, like I said, and that is so not fun because I got to pull pretty much the entire intake off, at least the first half of the intake plenum, and that's just super annoying. I'd rather not get into that, so I'm really glad it worked out the way that it did. So I'm going to get on to disassembling that cam gear. Super easy, honestly. Like, there's a lot of people that say that it's really hard and you really got to pay attention to what you're doing. You do have to pay attention to what you're doing. You just got to make sure it's in the same orientation as when you disassembled it. So I usually just use like a paint pen and mark it. So that right there is the O-ring that we're going to be replacing, and it's pretty hard. You can see I just moved it and it cracked. So that's where our leak was coming from, is this little guy right there. I'm going to go ahead and get everything cleaned up and we'll be able to reassemble it. Alright, so if you guys look at the inside of this gear, right about here, one of the teeth is actually a different size than all the rest. That means that really this part and this part can only be put on one way. The only thing you have to worry about is how you stick this thing into this thing. You want this shoulder to be going down, or else you'll limit the range of motion of the entire thing. You just got to line it up. There's only one way that this thing will go in, and once it's there, it'll all just fall into place. Now for the O-ring, you want to make sure this entire groove is nice and clean. Then once it's clean, what I usually do is I put some engine assembly grease into it. This is going to help hold the O-ring in place. So this is a rebuild kit right here. It comes with the O-ring and the front seal. I get these from Drift Motion. Super nice, super cheap, gets the job done. So these O-rings are a little bit small, so sometimes I like to kind of stretch them out a little bit. Nothing too crazy, but just kind of give them a good little stretch. And then you can plop it on in, and the grease should hold it in place. Now I'm going to go ahead and get our gear completely put together. Hold the inner part with my finger to make sure it doesn't fall in. Find the right groove, and just like that, gear is assembled. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this O-ring's still in the groove. Go ahead and line it all up. Just like that. And then you can bolt it on. Perfect. All right, our belt is on. Basically, you want to match these timing marks up to the ones on the timing cover. And then on the front of this pulley, there's a little dimple that you have to match up with a little raised dimple on the oil pump. Super simple. Honestly, kind of hard to get it wrong, but we'll go through everything just to make sure it's perfect. Throw the tensioner in, and then we'll verify. All right, so since I'm reusing my tensioner, I have to go and recompress it, so I just usually do that on a vise and just go super slow with it, just to squeeze the tensioner back to where it'll fit a pin into it, and then I usually just stick an Allen wrench in it so then I can just pull it out and tension the belt. So now we're all done. I'm gonna go ahead and torque this guy the same way that I took it off, and we should be able to start putting stuff back together. So now I just gotta torque this guy down to 60 foot-pounds. There we go. She's good. It wasn't even sketchy. It wasn't even sketchy. Easy. Now as for the plug, this guy is going to get one of these new seals, so we can pull this guy all the way off. That guy is getting replaced with the one from the Drift Motion kit. Go ahead and get that little guy on there. And send her home. So I gave all my timing covers a very extensive cleaning. So now I can throw this all back together. It's all just the same as when we took it apart, so I'm not really going to include too much of it, but you guys will see this when it's most of the way back together. Now that we're completely timed, I'm going to go ahead and spin the engine over 2 full revolutions to make sure that our timing marks land in the right spots. So right there we should be lined up with the dots. And then right there we should be lined up with the lines, and it looks like we're perfect, boys. So I've got everything assembled. Engine is pretty much done. Just gotta throw the radiator in, and then I will get this all buttoned up. I'll put coolant in it and get it ready to ship.